Coincidences happen all the time around us. Finding out you share the same name as a new coworker, or bumping into somebody you were just thinking about, or experiencing a real life shipwreck that weirdly mirrors a fictional story from 46 years earlier, where 4 men are stuck on a lifeboat forced to draw straws on who they're gonna eat to survive. Like I said, they're all around us. Throughout history, humans have experienced some crazy coincidences, but there is one coincidence that is believed to be the single craziest of all time. But let's start with some runner-ups. Starting off with number 1, the Eban Brothers. The date is July 30th, 1974, and 17-year-old Neville Eban is riding his moped in the town of Sandys, Bermuda, where he grew up. Out of nowhere, a taxi driver comes up and hits Neville off of his bike. So instantly, the taxi driver, whose name is Willard Manders, and his passenger, who we'll name Joe, get out of the taxi to try and see if Neville's okay. They call police, they call medical, but it wasn't enough, and Neville ends up passing away. Now, this is where things get a little weird. Almost exactly 1 year later, July 18th, 1975, Neville's younger brother, Erskine Eban, who's 17 years old, decides to go out for a ride on his moped. The same moped that Neville owns. So he's riding this moped in Sandys, Bermuda, and gets hit by a taxi. Not only was it the same car that hit his brother almost a year earlier, but it was driven by the same guy, Willard Manders, and had the same passenger, Joe. So Willard Manders and Joe get out of the car to try and see if they can save Erskine, but it wasn't enough, and Erskine ends up passing away. So let's recap. Not only were both boys struck by the same taxi, but that taxi was driven by the same person, Willard Manders, with the same passenger, Joe. Both brothers were riding the same moped, they were both 17 years old, and it happened almost exactly a year apart. Next, we have The Wreck of the Titan. In 1898, author Morgan Robertson published a novella named Futility, later retitled The Wreck of the Titan. The story features a fictional ocean liner named the Titan that is the biggest ship of its time. In the book, people call it an unsinkable ship, and it's about to go on its maiden voyage across the North Atlantic. Okay, and then it collides with an iceberg. Now, what do you think the main cause of loss was on the Titan? Insufficient lifeboats. You probably know where I'm going with this. 14 years after this novella was published, the Titanic went on its maiden voyage, hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and suffered significant loss because of insufficient lifeboats. Both boats were named unsinkable and the biggest of their time, with the Titan coming in at 800 feet in the story, and the Titanic coming in at 882.5 feet in real life. And they're basically the same name. Just chop off the IC at the end. Next, we have Lincoln and Kennedy similarity. I'm sure you've heard a bunch of comparisons between Lincoln and Kennedy's presidency, but there's also a bunch of misinformation in these comparisons. For example, Lincoln did not have a secretary named Kennedy. However, there are proven coincidences that I think are pretty interesting. For example, they both started in Congress and were elected exactly 100 years apart. Lincoln in 1846 and Kennedy in 1946. And obviously, they both went on to be president, but were elected exactly 100 years apart. Lincoln in 1860 and Kennedy in 1960. Both presidential terms ended due to assassination that happened on a Friday in the presence of their wives. Both successors of the presidents were named Johnson. For Lincoln, it was Andrew Johnson, and for JFK, it was Lyndon B. Johnson. And both assassins, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, are known by 3 names and died before trial. Next, we have Joseph Figlock and the Saved Infants. Joseph Figlock was a street sweeper in Detroit in the late 1930s. He was a very normal guy that just went about his business. Now, in 1937, while cleaning an alley on John R. Street, Figlock was struck by an infant that fell from a 4th-story window. Both Figlock and the baby suffered injuries, but both survived. Approximately 1 year later, 1938, Figlock was sweeping an alleyway on 77 East and Canfield Avenue. As he was sweeping, David Thomas, a 2-year-old, tumbles out of a 4th-story window, landing on Figlock. Again, both of them were injured, but both survived. The guy saved 2 babies almost a year apart from a 4th-story fall. Next, we have King Umberto and the Doppelganger. In the year 1900, the King of Italy, King Umberto, went to a small restaurant in Monza, Italy. Mind you, he's never been here before, so he gets seated at a table, and the owner comes from the back to come greet the king. And as the restaurant owner comes from the back, they lock eyes. And they just stare at one another. Why are they staring at one another? Because they look exactly alike. So they start talking with one another because they look exactly the same. And they find out that they're both named Umberto, which is crazy as is until you hear the rest of this. Both of them were reportedly born on the same day, March 14th, 1844, in the same town of Turin, Italy. Both of them married a woman named Margherita, and both had sons named Vittorio. I don't know if I said that right. And the restaurant owner is said to have opened his establishment the same day that Umberto got crowned. Sadly, the coincidences keep going. On July 29th, 1900, the restaurant owner allegedly died in an accident. And later that day, King Umberto was assassinated. They died on the same exact day. Now, there is some skepticism regarding this entire story and the coincidences within. There are some verifiable truths, but some of them lend themselves more to folklore than the actual fact of what happened. Now, all of those coincidences I think are super interesting, but the single greatest coincidence of all time is this: the tragic tale of Arthur Gordon Pym. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his one and only novel, The Tragic Tale of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. In the book, there's this boat called the Grampus that gets caught in a really bad storm, and only 4 people are able to make it onto a lifeboat and survive. There was Arthur, Dirk, Augustus, and this guy named Richard Parker. Now, Richard was a young sailor, the youngest and least experienced of the 4. And after being stranded at sea for a few days, the group ended up facing starvation and decided to eliminate Richard Parker to eat him. Doing this allows all 3 of them to survive long enough and get help, which they all did, except for Richard Parker. Now, this is where things get weird. 46 years later, a boat called the Minhoney, I don't know. This boat gets caught in a really bad storm, and only 4 people are able to make it onto a lifeboat and survive. Their names were Tom, Edwin, Edmund, and Richard Parker. Richard was the youngest of the 4 and a stowaway on the boat. Now, the group is stranded in this lifeboat for 24 days. And after the 24 days, they start to face starvation. So the group is forced to make a decision. Who are they gonna eat? The 3 men decide to eliminate Richard Parker to save the rest of them. Doing this allows all 3 men to survive long enough to get help. Verbatim to the book. Now, in the real life version, the 3 men who got saved ended up going back to England and all got arrested, and 2 of them got charged with murder and cannibalism for murdering and eating Richard Parker. So it all ended up okay. Not for Richard, though. There you have it, the objectively craziest coincidence of all time. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. And feel free to subscribe, because it's free.